Hi everyone, welcome to this session. In this session, we'll be looking at the possible research topics for the paper for this class. It's important to remember that if you do not want to do one of these topics, that you will need to discuss the topic with me before you move forward with it. The reason is that the paper is going to focus on a challenging uh, biblical passage. And what I mean by challenging is not necessarily the content, although that's part of it, but more so some of the other things related to a specific passage. The purpose of this paper is not to explain, in most cases, what a particular passage means per se. So, you know, choosing John 3:16, for example, is not going to get approved, not because it's not an important passage, certainly, but because there's really not that much controversy about it. And the reason I'm looking for you to do a paper related to a passage that has controversy is because of the need to learn how to present both sides, weigh evidence for both sides, and then draw a conclusion. And so the passages that I've chosen are passages about which there is some sort of challenge or controversy, most of them not specifically related to the particular content of the passage, although some of them are. So please make sure to get in contact with me to discuss your topic, especially if you're not going to choose one of the topics in the approved topics list. If you choose one of those topics, you don't need to discuss it, but certainly feel free to talk to me about it. But in this video, I'll go through the different topics that are on the list to describe and discuss some of the issues that are present in these particular passages to kind of give you a heads up or a jump start on that. Now, when we talk about these passages, as I mentioned, some of them are related to content, some of them aren't. So I'll try to give you a good overview, but certainly if you have any questions, feel free to get in contact with me. You're also welcome to do a little digging before you decide on your topic. The first topic in the list is Genesis chapter 4, verses 4 and 5, which is there on your screen. The idea behind the problem with this passage is, of course, the question of why did God reject Cain's offering and accept Abel's offering? Now, there have been a wide variety of theories about this over the years, trying to identify the reason for this distinction. Some people have noted that, and actually probably could include verse 3 here, that Abel's sacrifice is based on animals, right? He brings the firstborn of his flock, where Cain brings fruit of the land. Others have said, no, it has to do with kind of the firstborn aspect here, right? These are the first fruits, so this kind of like the best of the flock, where Cain is just bringing kind of whatever from the land. And so, you're going to have a variety of issues here, a variety of answers here, and the goal is to, kind of make a decision. I'm looking for you to kind of weigh the evidence. What seems most likely to you? Of course, these passages about which there have been controversy for centuries. So I'm not asking you, or not expecting you to, solve it. Right, here is the absolute answer. But I am kind of expecting you to think about, this is the most likely, what seems most likely to me, and why. That's more of what I'm looking for you to address. And so again, solving the issue of why Cain's sacrifice was rejected and Abel's was accepted Certainly you're not going to solve it and convince everybody. But what is it that seems most likely to you? The second passage is Genesis chapter 22, a rather long passage, which is why I didn't quote the passage here. But Genesis 22 recounts the sacrifice of Isaac. Now, on the surface, we might say, well, what's the controversy here? God commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham goes to sacrifice Isaac, makes all the preparations, and then right before he sacrifices Isaac, God provides a ram. God stops him, provides a ram to be sacrificed in place of Isaac. But considering that throughout, particularly the Old Testament, God condemns particularly child sacrifice, and by extension human sacrifice, and not just refusing or wanting, and not just saying I don't want child sacrifice, but also condemning people and condemning some of the other nations for sacrificing children. How in this case does God, order or command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? So what you would be looking for in this passage is thinking about what are some of the reasons that people have come up with to say, here's what God is doing in such a way that it prevents people from condemning God, right? It prevents charging God with evil. And because as Christians, our base foundation would be, well, God doesn't do anything evil. So if child sacrifice is evil, why is he commanded here? And so that's what you would be looking for in this passage. This is a challenging passage to do. I don't know that it's necessarily the hardest on this list, but it is one of the hardest on this list. So if you like a challenge, I'd encourage you to take this one on. I don't say that to kind of dissuade anybody from it, but I do want to say up front, this one is a very challenging passage to try and just, pull together information on. So you got a lot of work ahead of you if you choose this passage, but I think it's a good one to choose. The third passage for consideration is actually a dual passage. 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 are parallel passages. 1 Chronicles 21 retells this passage from 2 Samuel chapter 24. The challenge with this passage, though, is some of the wording here. Now, essentially what we're talking about, to give you an idea of what's going on here, David decides to number or take a census of the nation of Israel. And after he does so, God punishes him for it, right? So this is something that's not pleasing in God's sight. But in these parallel passages, notice that at the top passage, which is 2 Samuel, it says the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David. Who's he? He, the Lord, incited David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah. But in 1 Chronicles it says, then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So in 2 Samuel it says the Lord was the one that incited David, kind of encourages David to number Israel, and then punishes him for it. But in 1 Chronicles, it says that Satan was the one that was responsible for inciting David to do this. And so the question is, okay, how do we reconcile these two different records of this event, right? One says God did it, one says Satan did it. And so, as you look at this, you're going to be looking probably in commentaries related both to 2 Samuel as well as 1 Chronicles. And so the question here, of course, is, who is the one that incites David to number Israel, and how does that relate to our understanding of God and what God does, etc. Isaiah 7:14 is a very important passage for Christians, particularly as it is quoted in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 1 to describe Jesus's virgin birth. In Matthew chapter 1, Matthew talks about Mary being a virgin. Luke chapter 2 talks about it as well, but the focus we're talking about here is in Matthew. And Matthew talks about Jesus's virgin birth being a fulfillment of a prophecy, and then he quotes Isaiah 7:14, or what we know as Isaiah 7:14. I have here, though, two different translations of Isaiah 7 and 14. The traditional rendering that you'll find in most versions these days says, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel," which is, the traditional rendering of it. It's the rendering that of this passage that you see in Matthew chapter 1 as well. But other translations translate it this way: "Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son." Now, this one can be a challenge. Certainly there's a challenge here, this question of, wait, what does this passage actually say? The Matthew passage is not as much of a question, because Matthew is written in Greek, and the Greek word that is used in Matthew is virgin. Right? So there's not a question there what the text says in Matthew. In Isaiah, though, the Hebrew, while traditionally it has been rendered virgin because of Matthew chapter 1, the word that is used there is throughout other places in the Old Testament translated young woman. And in fact, some translations that have translated young woman faced a lot of controversy because of people saying, well, the translators are trying to reject the virgin birth. And so many of the translations that in one edition said young woman have changed and gone with virgin, gone back to virgin. And so the question here is, should this word be translated virgin, or should it be translated young woman? Now again, in Matthew, the word that Matthew uses does refer to a virgin woman. Right? So it specifically has the notions of virginity, where Isaiah 7:14, there's a little bit more question. Now, of course, this relies on a very technical issue. I don't think necessarily that you would have to know a lot of Hebrew to do this topic, although it is going to rely on the question of the translation of the particular Hebrew word. So just kind of keep that in mind. How much do you want to get in the weeds of some language study? It certainly does raise the question of, if it should be translated young woman, and Matthew translates it virgin, what does that have to say? And it also raises the question of, who is this passage talking about? Now, as Christians, we've tended to think about this passage talking about Jesus because of its quotation in Matthew chapter 1. But if it should be understood as young woman, whether or not that connects with virginity, that raises some additional questions about understanding the passage in Isaiah, and how that connects necessarily with the passage in Matthew. So, that's part of where some of this challenge comes from. So those are the Old Testament passages to consider doing. Let's switch now and talk about some New Testament passages. In the New Testament, one of the first passages to consider doing is Mark chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. Now, Mark 16, 9 through 20 deals with post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. Mark talks about a variety of women and the apostles and others that Jesus appears to. However, if you'll notice in your translation, if you have a newer translation, Mark 16, 9 through 20 is marked off, sometimes in brackets, sometimes by extended space between verse 8 and verse 9. And most newer translations will have some sort of footnote or maybe comment in the text that Mark 16, 9 through 20 is missing in some very important manuscripts, very old Greek manuscripts. So the question, if you choose this paper topic, would be, does Mark 16, 9 through 20 belong in the Gospel of Mark? Right? Is it the ending of the Gospel of Mark? There are a variety of theories about this. There are certainly some people suggest that Mark 16 ended in verse 8, which kind of leaves some things hanging. And so if it ends in verse 8, there's some important questions there. And there are a variety of arguments that they use, including things like it's missing from two of the most important Greek manuscripts that we have, as well as some others. That the words that are used in verses 9 through 20, Mark has not used them in other places in his gospel. And so that, the vocabulary choice and some things related to the actual wording. Others would argue that it belongs and makes their cases based on some other manuscripts as to why it belongs. But there are a variety of theories about, was this something that Mark originally wrote? Was it something that somebody, kind of a follower of Mark or one of Mark's close companions wrote based off of notes, right? So there's a variety of theories that if it belongs there, why it belongs there, or who actually wrote it or not. So there's a lot of different theories related to this passage, very similar to the passage that we're using as our example passage from John chapter 7, 53 through 8:11, right? But some slight differences about that. So a very challenging passage. And it's a very interesting passage or an interesting question because of some of the teachings that are drawn out of those verses in Mark 16. And so it does raise a question of, if this was not the original ending of Mark, but was later added, what does that do to those teachings? Now, I would argue that anything taught in verses 9 through 20 is taught in other places. Things like what's called the Great Commission, about Jesus' commission to the apostles about going into the world, preaching the gospel, baptizing, disciples, etc. All that is taught in other places. That Jesus appeared to people after his resurrection, all that is taught in other places as well. So, there's not anything in Mark 16, 9 through 20 that we would lose if it's not authentic. And so that's an important part to keep in here as well. This next passage is an interesting one, 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And then there's these next three come from 1 Corinthians. I believe we've talked about this before when we were talking about translations, but this is a possible passage for you to do. And to just refresh your memory here, of course, this slide is the verses rendered in the King James Version, which says, "But if any man think that he behaveth unseemly or uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age, and so need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. Nevertheless, he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power over his own will, and hath so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, doeth well. So that he that giveth her in marriage doeth well, but he that giveth her not in marriage doeth better." Now, of course, there's a challenge for a lot of people to kind of understand the King James to begin with. But this passage of behaving uncomely toward a virgin, his virgin, what does that mean? His virgin what? the two major options are reflected in different translations. So this was the King James, reading it very, very literally, right, compared to the Greek text. The New American Standard translates it this way: but if any man thinks that he is acting unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter. Now you'll notice daughter here is in italics, which the New American Standard used to indicate that they're supplying this word to help you understand what's being talked about in the Greek text. Unbecomingly toward his virgin daughter, if she is past her youth, and if it must be so, let him do what he wishes. He does not sin, let her marry. But he who stands firm in his heart, being under no constraint, but has authority over his own will, and has decided this in his own heart to keep his own virgin daughter, he will do well. So then both he who gives his own virgin daughter in marriage does well, and he who does not give her in marriage will do better. All right, so the New American Standard translators took this as, this is talking about a man who has a daughter who's a virgin, and he's decided, because of the current situation, right, taking into consideration the larger context of 1 Corinthians 7, that he is going to keep his daughter from marrying. He's not going to try and marry her off. And so on this version, Paul's saying that's fine. Right. But the New International Version and a lot of other newer versions translate it somewhat differently. The NIV says, if anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he is engaged to. Some newer translations will say something like that, or will even say fiancé, right? Not acting honorably toward his fiancé. And if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning, they should get married. But the man who has settled the matter in his own mind, who is under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, again, some translations would say his fiancée, this man also does the right thing. So then he who marries the virgin does right, but he who does not marry her does better. So in this approach, which is quite different, right? There's a lot of difference between your daughter and your fiancé. So in this approach, the idea would be, here is a man and a woman who have gotten engaged, but because of their spiritual commitments, have decided, they still want that connection, but they are not going to fulfill that. They're not going to consummate this relationship. They're not going to get married. And Paul basically says, if you can do that, that's fine. Right, so getting married is fine, but also remaining in this state of purity, but also, with that companionship, that's fine. So, this of course, there's quite a bit of difference here between a daughter and a fiance, and so this passage would essentially be, you'd be looking at this question of, what's the evidence for daughter, what's the evidence for fiance, and then ultimately coming to what you think is the likely conclusion. That's an important aspect of this passage. The second passage to look at in 1 Corinthians is from chapter 11. And here Paul writes, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Because of the angels what, Paul? Right? What does Paul mean by because of the angels? Now, the larger context here has to do with women praying and prophesying with their heads uncovered, and Paul says they need to be covered. That's a different issue, right? So, that's not so much the issue you're looking at with this passage, but this question of because of the angels. What does it mean? Why does Paul root the reason for wearing a symbol of authority in because of the angels? And there's a couple of different thoughts about this. One is that because angels engage in orderly worship, then we as the church need to engage in orderly worship because the angels exhibit the authority of God in their worship. We have to exhibit authority as well. One of those is wives wearing something that symbolizes their husband's authority during worship. Another idea is that that if women did not have their hair covered, their heads covered, it would be sexually tempting for angels. Now, I think there's some problems with that view, and I won't go into it, but that is one of the things that people suggest. And then a third view, and there are others as well, so you'd have to explore this a little bit more, is that angels here should be translated messengers. In the Greek, the same word for angels, what we think of as angelic beings, messengers from God, etc., that can also be translated messenger, like a human messenger. And so if it should be better translated messenger in the sense of a human messenger, the idea is that if these messengers from other churches come to Corinth and they see that you're not going about this the right way, if you're not wearing the head covering, if you're not having this notion of authority, that's going to cause an offense, that's going to cause a stumble to these human messengers. So there's the question of why this would address angels, as well as the question of, is this an angel or is this meant to be understood as a messenger? The last passage from 1 Corinthians is this rather interesting one about baptism for the dead. Now, the context of 1 Corinthians 15 is about the resurrection, and Paul asserting to the Corinthians that they need to recognize that the dead are going to be raised. And then he says here in 15:29, related to some practices going on in Corinth, otherwise, what do people mean by being baptized on behalf of the dead? If the dead are not raised at all, why are people baptized on their behalf? What is baptism for the dead? Well, we don't decisively know. At one point, I've heard someone suggest that there are at least 200 different interpretations of this passage. Now, I think that's probably hyperbole. And if there are 200 interpretations, you would not need to go through all 200 in your paper. But you would want to take some of the major ones. Some of this is suggesting somebody, what we might call proxy baptism, somebody being baptized on behalf of somebody that has died. Others suggest that it has to do with spiritual death, right? Somebody that's spiritually dead being baptized. So there are a couple of different things that are described here. What's important on a side note to note is that Paul doesn't say much about it. As soon as the Corinthians know what he's talking about, and he doesn't really condemn or approve the practice. Instead, he's saying, right, you have somewhat of a contradictory position here if you're doing this, but you're also rejecting resurrection. So even though we might not know exactly what Paul's talking about, we do know that how it functions within his argument. So again, multitude of different interpretations on this passage. I think that this might be a good one for you if you're interested in kind of really digging in and exploring like a lot of different options and say, okay, let me really think about these and what seems to be the most likely. So you have a lot of choices here. Outside of Corinthians, let's turn to some of the other options. One is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Again, this passage rather long for the slide, but it refers to a man of sin or a man of lawlessness, depending on your translation. And Paul puts this in the context of the second coming of Christ. Part of the reason for the delay of the second coming of Christ, that there will be this man of sin or man of lawlessness that will be revealed. And then Paul goes on to talk about things like, he sits in the temple of God and presents himself above God, and the Lord's going to destroy him with the brightness of his coming, but he does signs and wonders according to the working of Satan. So the question here would be, who is this man of sin? Who is this man of lawlessness? And there have been a couple different hypotheses about this. One has suggested that it was the Pope, right? That the man of sin or manless lawlessness here is the Pope. I don't believe that that's what it's talking about, but that's certainly a major one that you would want to explore. Others have suggested that what this refers to is an individual who will rise up at the end of time, deceive the world right before the second coming of Jesus. And so you'll want to explore that one a little bit and see, who is this referred to? Again, it's one of these things where the Thessalonians knew what Paul's talking about. Paul gave them some additional information that we don't have access to. So again, an absolute conclusion here would be very, very difficult. But I do think that there's some interesting things related to this passage. 1 Timothy chapter 3, Paul is giving qualifications to Timothy for church leaders, overseers or bishops. While he gives a variety of qualifications, the one that I want you to focus on in this passage is that phrase, the husband of one wife. Right? Therefore, an overseer must be the husband of one wife. A couple different questions here related to, what does it mean, husband of one wife? Does that mean one wife at a time, in the sense of he's rejecting polygamy here? Does this mean only one wife? He's only ever had one wife. So could someone get a divorce and still be an overseer or a bishop? If the wife of this individual dies and he remarries, does he still qualify as the husband of one wife? And so the question here is, well, what does this mean by husband of one wife? Is it rejection of polygamy? Is it a rejection of divorce? Again, just because a Christian isn't qualified to be an elder, be an overseer, doesn't necessarily mean they're a second-class Christian, right? So this isn't a question of, can a divorced person be a Christian, or anything along those lines. But it is a matter of, all right, for these church leaders, is Paul saying, all right, this is somebody who's only ever been married once, or is it, this is someone who, when he is appointed, this leader is only married to one woman. The last passage that I've put in the list for you to think about, perhaps do your paper on, is from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 to 22. Now, this passage in verse 21 talks about baptism. And while there's a lot of controversy about baptism and the question of, who's baptism for, how should baptism be done, what does baptism do? That's not what I want you to focus on in this passage. Instead, the part to focus on is in the first part. Right? So Peter writes, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah." Who are these spirits in prison? When did Jesus go and preach to them? What was the purpose of preaching to them? There are a couple of different ideas about this. One is the idea that during the time between Jesus' death and his resurrection, he descended into the realm of the dead to those that are on the punishment side, and offered them the chance to repent. Now, again, I personally don't believe that's accurate. I think there are other passages that teach against opportunities after death to repent, but that's one version that people have put forth. Other people have said, no, this is talking about how Christ's Spirit was inspiring Noah to preach to people while he was building the ark, right? So Christ was in Noah, giving him the message. Those people, their spirits are now in prison. Right? They rejected him, so now they're being punished. Others say no, it is during that time of that Christ, not so much preaching repentance, but preaching victory, right? So all those people that had rejected God's will in previous generations, Christ is saying, look, I have conquered, I have won, I've defeated death, etc. Kind of a, praising God in the proclamation. So it's not so much preaching repentance or preaching the gospel, it is proclaiming victory. There are a couple other passages or options that are given there as well, but those are some of the major ones. So those are the basic passages in the topics list. Hopefully you'll find one that will be interesting to you. Hopefully you'll find one that you'll be interested in exploring more. Certainly, if you have any questions about anything that I've shared here or any of these passages, feel free to get in contact with me. But don't forget as well to look under the folder for the assignment, what you need to do, and make sure that you're completing that assignment. As I mentioned before, if you want to do a different passage than those that we've talked about here, you will need to get in contact with me about it. I would also encourage you, if you haven't already, to take a look at the sample paper, which is under useful links, to get an idea of what am I looking for you to do in this paper. Of course, that paper covers John chapter 20, verses 30 through 31, which, along with John 7:53 through 8:11, are two passages you're not allowed to do, predominantly because I'm giving you an example paper on it, right? And in class we're going through the woman taken adultery passage. So look at that paper. It has a good setup, does a good job, presenting the different options, etc. So that gives you an idea of what I'm looking for in your paper. Like, you want to talk about the different options, the evidence for it, and then draw a conclusion. If you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact with me, and I'm looking forward to reading your papers.